All right, welcome everyone. I am Aria Costa. My pronouns are she, her, and ella, and I am the Behavioral Health Equity Specialist at the Texas Institute for Excellence in Mental Health, housed at the University of Texas at Austin. For those calling in or in listening only mode, I'm going to do a visual description of myself. I am a light-skinned Latina with long brown hair. I'm wearing glasses and a purple sweater. I'm very pleased to be your host for this webinar titled Tending to Anti-Asian Racialized Trauma Through Decolonial Collective Healing. Thank you all for joining us. We truly hope you find today's presentation engaging and helpful in your work. This webinar is brought to you by the South-Southwest Mental Health Technology Transfer Center, or MHTTC for short, an initiative funded by the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, to provide free training and ongoing consultation to all professionals that serve individuals with mental health challenges. Our region is Region 6, covering the states of Texas, Oklahoma, New Mexico, Arkansas, Louisiana, and our tribal communities. The South-Southwest MHTTC is a project of the Texas Institute for Excellence in Mental Health, which is housed at the School of Social Work at the University of Texas at Austin. This presentation was prepared for the MHTTC network under a cooperative agreement from the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, also known as SAMHSA. The opinions expressed in the presentation are the views of our speaker and do not reflect the official position of the Department of Health and Human Services, or SAMHSA. We have a code of conduct for all of our events. We're dedicated to providing an event where everyone, regardless of gender identity and expression, sexual orientation, disabilities, neurodiversity, physical appearance, body size, ethnicity, nationality, race, age, religion, and any other intersectional identities, feels welcome. We invite everyone to help us achieve a safe, respectful, inclusive, and positive environment for learning. And to that end, we reserve the right to remove participants who don't follow this code or participate in a harmful way after being asked to collaborate with us on this matter. When you participate in an event hosted by us, you are contributing to the overall experience, which makes us all accountable to each other. Let's have a welcoming and enjoyable session. Thank you for your collaboration. All right, we have an amazing presenter with us today. We're very, very excited to have her. Melody Lee. Melody is a queer therapist of color, mental health liberation activist, and keynote speaker. Melody founded Inclusive Therapist, a mental health directory and community that celebrates and centers people with marginalized identities, especially the BIPOC, X2S, LGBTQIA+ intersection. Melody offers collective care and education focusing on decolonizing mental health and healing racialized trauma. Thank you so much, Melody, for being with us today. I'll pass the mic over to you.
Ooh, such an honor to be in your presence, everyone. Hello, thank you for taking time to introduce yourselves in the chat. Thank you for this wonderful introduction, Ari. Deeply appreciate you. So I'm noticing that there are folks that are joining us from many different places, which I'm excited about. And I'm just gonna take a breath and feel my heartbeat. Even though we're not in a physical circle, I consider us in a circle together today. I'm gonna seek your permission right now to lead us into a time of land acknowledgement. This is a practice that is indigenous to peoples of Turtle Island. It is not my indigenous practice. However, as a diasporic settler here, I would like to take some time to invite us to consider the land that we're on and our duty and responsibilities on this land. We acknowledge that we're meeting on various stolen lands that are sacred to a number of indigenous peoples. So in this moment, I invite you to take some time to think about communities of indigenous folks around you I am located on the land of Chumano Nation, Tokawa Tribe, Coahuiltica Nation, just to name a few. We thank the Indigenous peoples for stewarding these lands for generations and continuing to do so. And we pay respect to the elders, past, present, and future. I acknowledge that as a settler, I occupy and participate in exploitation of land that are not mine. I advocate for land back and Indigenous sovereignty. So with reverence and gratitude, I invite us to meet with the intention to learn, to heal, change, and decolonize our ways of being, and to dismantle colonial systems, which I'll explain a bit more later on. May we as a community consider our roles in the liberation and restoration of land, language, and cultures for all Indigenous peoples and forcefully displaced communities. We pay respect to our ancestors that guide us as we reflect on our responsibilities and impact on this and future generations. We're talking about decolonization. Just as a kind reminder, this is not a metaphor, and decolonization is oftentimes now used in academic spaces. We talk about it in mental health as something that's conceptual. Tuck and Yang reminds us that it is about the rematriation of Indigenous land and life. Bhatia reminds us that Indigenous American theorists have insisted that the decolonization model is not simply about taking a social justice perspective. It is about reclaiming land, territory, water, and language. Decolonization means restoring what was lost. And this is the invitation for us to pay attention to our body's relationship with the land that we're on. And what is this relationship? Is it one that extends to restoration and land back, or is it one that is extractive or exploitive? So these are conversations that we're going to have more, but I'm going to invite us to start thinking about that. For migrants and immigrants, this means advocating for restoration of Indigenous sovereignty as diasporic settlers on Turtle Island and in our motherland. So today we are focusing on Asian communities, and colonization, imperialism is also in many of our lived experiences, in our lived lineage experiences. And so for many of migrants that have experienced colonization, finding this place of what is our duty here, but also feeling a sense of maybe longing to advocate for decolonialism in our motherland is something that I'll expand on a little bit more too. So thank you for joining me in this time of land acknowledgement. Where am I going? Thank you, Audrey, for giving an introduction to me. I don't have very much to add, except this photo is of me and my grandma Lulu. I stand on the shoulders of my grandmothers, who are just remarkable, strong, loving women. I'm a Hong Konger born in a British colony. I'm a migrant and settler. I embody a number of social privileges. Gender, I'm not disabled, education, class background, skin color. My paternal name means forest of the tree. That's Lee. My maternal name means forest, which is lamb. I'm from a lineage of Fisher people. I use pronouns ko and any in English. As a mental health liberation activist, I co-created the inclusive therapist community among communities. Some of you are here with us today. Thank you. And we offer monthly CEU trainings featuring diverse presenters, focusing on decolonizing and destigmatizing mental health care. So if you are only hearing about us for the first time, I invite you to visit our website and to check us out and consider joining and being a part of these conversations. Visual description of me: I am light to medium skin, East Asian, femme presenting person that's wearing a tank top, dark tank top. My hair is in this pixie cut, which might be new to some of you. I have a septum piercing. I am in a thinner body. Although I've been told that I am quite swole, and that's something that I accept about myself. It's different here in the webinar setting. I don't get to hear the chuckles. So feel free to chuckle along in the chat if that's something if I actually make you laugh. I want to share a little bit about, thank you, my positionality. Today I'm speaking from my lived experience as a medium skin colony born person that's native to Hong Kong. I'm a settler here, so I do not speak on behalf of Indigenous communities here or any other communities of color. My teachers are Indigenous, Black, and people of color that generously share their ancestral knowledge and lived experiences with me. And I give them credit and gratitude to my teachers and their ancestors. Throughout the presentation, you will see the names of some of my teachers. And so feel free to, read more about their work as we move along. I embody, this is important, I embody internalized coloniality. And I'm unlearning and healing. And so I'm going to show up as myself, which is imperfectly. And so in situations where I may cause rupture, I may offend, I will take accountability and seek repair. And so if that happens, I invite you to let me know so that I can seek repair with you. My work is grounded on land back and Indigenous sovereignty, Black liberation and reparations, justice, equity, and liberations for all humans and other than humans facing oppression, violence, exploitation, erasure, and forced displacement. My work is grounded on ecological justice and sovereignty. It's dismantling white patriarchal hegemony and abolition of all institutions of violence. And why I share this is because your consent matters to me. I think it's important for you to have transparency about who I am, my positionality, and my framework to decide whether or not you choose to be here with us. That is your choice, which I honor. So in continuation of a consent-centered practice, this is just a way that can remind us to hold space for collective care when we're here together. Even though we're virtual, we are still together in presence. We're together, we are interconnected, right? We can feel into one another. So some things that I hope would be helpful on the left side, left column, minding our power. In this moment, invite you to also take notice of your intersecting identities, right? Because we have parts of our identities that may hold power and privilege, and other parts that may hold less privilege or may have also experienced oppression and marginalization. So notice how these parts intersect and how you're showing up today. Be conscious of your power and mindful of how you take up space. In the work that I do, I prioritize the voices that have historically been silenced and erased, and that will continue to be the case here today. So notice any discomfort that might show up, stay curious, and I invite you to process in community if discomfort is showing up. To be really honest, I anticipate that's going to happen. There are going to be moments when I feel uncomfortable too, that I will need, folks to come around me. So just want to, be transparent about that. On the right-hand column about collective care, we are in a time of collective crisis. And I'm wondering how many of y'all feel like just exhausted, like no amount of self-care is enough. I wonder how many of you here have lost sleep. How many of you don't taste the food that you eat the same way as you used to, right? And so we're in a time of collective crisis. Please be gentle with yourself and one another. There will be discussions of trauma that may be triggering. In fact, majority of the conversations we'll have will be centered around traumas and ruptures. And so it's extra important that you plan ways to care for yourself well. Feel free to stretch, drink water, hug a furry friend. I don't know where my furry friends are right now. Hope they come back. I have my tea I'm going to continue to sip on. And lastly, exercise your right of refusal. If there are things that I'm sharing that you don't feel ready to hear right now, you like to circle back, this is recorded, so you're welcome to circle back, or you might just say, you know what, this is not for me, and that's okay too. Cup of coffee. Part of collective care, my favorite way of collective care is food. And, you know, I think it's a Kanto thing. I think it's very much an Asian thing. And also it's a POC thing, that we love to share food. When we share food, it's not only about the food, right? It's about the stories. It's about the laughter. It's about the connection. We share food when we celebrate. We share food when we mourn and grieve. We share food, you know, I'm going to start saying some stereotypes about Asians. Like, Asians will find any opportunity to sneak food in. We're going on a hike, we're going to have to talk about the food, right? We're watching a movie, we're going to talk about the food. So food is something that is very grounding for me. And so this is an invitation for you. Thank you for contributing to the chat, to draw upon a food memory that connects you with your people, your culture, and ancestors. And what I aim to do right now is actually to, as a part of collective care, to build a bit of a buffet or a potluck. So I invite you to share in the chat box with community a food memory that connects you with your people, culture, and ancestors. And type it in so we can have a spread as the grounding for our collective care space today. Here at the bottom, so I'll be watching while you're typing. Here at the bottom, I have some mooncake, which is a celebratory festive food that my people eat during the Mid-Autumn Festival, which is coming up. And this reminds me of lighting lanterns with my cousins and grandparents in Hong Kong, and the adults would be sipping tea, chatting. We would be running around and eating these sweet cakes, and there usually be, just table full of food. And that really, when I think about that, even when I eat the mooncake today, I feel a sense of connection to my people. How about for you? So I'm gonna give y'all a couple minutes to fill our table, and I'm not gonna be able to read everyone out loud, but I am watching. Oh yeah, youtiao. Kanji, yes. Kimchi, yes. Wow. Yes. Oh, yummy, yummy. I'm noticing comfort food. That seems to be a theme. Oh my goodness. Yes. You know, when you walk into a home and you can just smell it and your body just goes, oh, I'm home. That feeling. Yes, thank you. I'm curious about green bread. Wow, thank you for building this feast. I am hungry. I invite you to keep, whoops. Sorry, I don't know. I'm gonna try to come back. Give me 1 second. What do I do? What happened to my video? Give me 1 second. I will try to fix this. There we go. Thank you for your patience. I mean it when I say I'm going to show up imperfectly. Oh, thank you. Fruit. Ube is one of my favorite flavors. Like, if there's an ube ice cream, I'm on it. So why I intend to do this is, as I'm talking about things that might be triggering, things that can feel heavy, parts of this presentation is going to be heavy. In those moments, I'm going to invite you to go back through the chat and then draw back upon this food memory. Let it wrap around you, right? Maybe close your eyes, think about the smells, think about your connection to your people, and allow that to wrap around you. I'm not going to say necessarily grounding, because what's going to show up for you is what's going to show up for you, right? I want to honor your experience, but know that you are connected with your people and that we are interconnected as well. As you can see, so many of you are sharing about memories with family, this kind of passing on of traditions, of recipes, and what that means. Because yes, so hold on to that. We're going to jump in. All right. And so today we're going to talk about tending to racialized trauma and rupture, and specifically focusing on East Asian, South Asian communities that have been experiencing a drastic uprise of anti-Asian violence in our communities, and currently still feeling unsafe to be out in the world. And this is, you know, one of the phrases that commonly as migrants, as Asian migrants, we hear, right? Where are you really from? Not just where are you from, but where are you really from? The message behind that is you don't belong here, right? So this is bringing up something for you. Go back to the buffet, go back to the food, right? You should feel grateful to be here. We hear that, which is saying you're undeserving. We hear, go back to where you came from. You're expendable, you don't belong. COVID is your fault. We are to blame and deserving to be punished, which is often how it lands, right? And I don't know about the participants here today who has experienced anti-Asian violence. I have during COVID personally. I know people that have as well. And today I'm going to offer a framework, and before COVID as well, thank you, over a framework around you know, I'm just gonna, sometimes when the words don't come, I just keep going. Chinese virus, what happens in your body when you see this phrase? And this is not something you necessarily need to share with the circle, but I want you to pay attention. When you see or hear Chinese virus, what happens to you? And I'm imagining it depends, right? It depends on your identity, your positionality, your relationship with Asian communities. And yes, thank you for that reminder. Even before COVID, we know that anti-Asian violence and anti-Asian racism exists, but this amplification really has shown us that we as a people are easily scapegoated. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about, you know, making connections with how this came to be in relations to many of our histories. Thank you for those that are sharing in the chat. I hear you. Heart rates, heat rises, exhaustion, anger. Yeah. And the framework that I'm going to offer when I talk about decolonial is we have to start by understanding what colonialism, coloniality is. And this is bigger than racism. Coloniality, capitalism, and white cis heteropatriarchal hegemony, meaning hierarchy, power hierarchy, power dynamics that keeps a certain group in position of power hoarding and monopolizing of power, are at the root of mental and relational distress. This is bigger than racism, right? These are power structures that are in place that grants certain groups more privilege and power, but then that power is often abused, misused to oppress groups that don't belong. When we're talking about colonization or colonialism, just want to give some definitions, names of teachers below. We're talking about the European invasion, occupation, exploitation, cultural domination that impact land, thought, behavior, and life. When you hear me talk about coloniality, coloniality is actually maybe one step deeper. It's about monopolizing power hierarchies through Eurocentric epistemology, knowledge, right? So there's a Eurocentric definition of knowledge. Eurocentric ontology, meaning being or reality, right? That there's a monopoly of Eurocentric ideas of reality are valid or the most valid. And also the Eurocentric ideology, beliefs. And when people that have experienced colonization, but also are, many, if not all of us are, even if we haven't experienced colonization, have been impacted by this coloniality of power, that ever since, probably before we're born, we're already told what is considered valid, what is considered reality, what is considered true, right? Oftentimes through this lens of Eurocentricity and American centricity. And in connection with colonization is that ruptures occur. A lot of ruptures occur. One being displacement, right? Displacement means people of a land either are forcibly or are threatened to by, or simply have to leave for their safety. And displacement can happen through genocide, through imperialism. It can be also happen through climate change, climate disaster, climate racism, right? Where these ruptures happen. So what was familiarity becomes disorientation. What was attachment to community, to peoples, to relationships, then becomes, oh, that's ruptured. Now I think back, there's nostalgia, but there isn't that intimate attachment. Displacement also causes what is connection, and it ruptures it into alienation, that I can't quite find my place here. And so for the migrants and immigrants among us, I'm curious to know, how many of you can relate to this, that you've heard themes of this in stories that maybe your grandparents, parents, or even you tell and hear in community. And which is why that table we built is so important, right? Because it's a way to return to familiarity, to return to attachment and connection when displacement threatens to rupture. These are ways of being. And with displacement also comes loss. And this is a portrait of my family, not all of them, some of them from Hong Kong, and I'm in there, but loss for displaced people can mean loss not just of place, but also of name, language, family, community, culture, traditions, voice, autonomy, security, stability, power, authority, expertise, credibility, belonging. So there are these layers and layers of losses and ruptures. And oftentimes in migrant families, these are simply too painful to talk about. Like, we are not necessarily having open dialogue or conversations about them, not necessarily because we're afraid to. It could be, right? Could be related maybe to shame, but a lot of times it's too painful, right? And so one false thing that I hear about mental health is Asian communities or migrant communities or communities of color do not talk about trauma because there's a stigma against it, or they don't know how to, or they're too ashamed to talk about it, right? That's why we need therapy, so that people can talk about their trauma. Actually, I push back against that. There's a lot of really valid reasons, survival reasons, why families that have experienced deep losses do not talk about it, and that healing and communication can come in different forms that are not verbal, not Eurocentric, right? And I'm going to talk more about that. And thank you for those that are continuing to contribute to the chat. Humanitarian crisis. Yeah, so for those of us that have to be displaced, I honor and also feel tender for the reasons why your people were displaced, which is why things like go back to where you come from are so painful to hear, right? When I hear that, I'm like, I wish I could. I wish I wasn't displaced in the first place. That's just a little bit of me. Moving on. So when we're talking about racialized trauma, it's important to have definitions. And Resmaa Menakem is a teacher that I admire, that has done a lot of writing and teaching and conceptualizing racialized trauma. And so I'm going to go through 3 slides to share what Resmaa has taught us. First thing is trauma is not emotional. Trauma always happens in the body. It is a spontaneous protective mechanism used by the body to stop or thwart further potential damage. It happens in the body. That means we don't think about it, we don't feel about it. It just happens, right? There's a survival mechanism that kicks in that says, I will do whatever I have to do to survive. And a lot of times these trauma responses are also passed down intergenerationally because our ancestors had to learn these responses to survive so that we can be here. Trauma number 2, trauma is not a flaw or a weakness. It is a highly effective tool of safety and survival. Sometimes I hear trauma like it's a bad word, right? Ooh, trauma. Actually, trauma is a highly effective tool for safety and survival. Does it have consequences sometimes? Yes, we're going to talk about that too. Trauma is not an event. Number 3, trauma is the body's protective response to events it perceives as potentially dangerous. So it's not the event itself, but rather our body saying, oh, that's dangerous. I know how to respond to protect myself and to survive. And I want to note here that white body supremacy, so that's Resmaa's verbiage, you know, white, cis hetero, patriarchal hegemony. That's how I like to draw it out, to be very specific. Resmaa defines it as a trauma response because there is a perceived potential threat that can threaten one's privilege or power. And so white body supremacy is a form of trauma response. And I really admire and ground my work in Resmaa's work. But as I'm teaching more about racialized trauma and also being in community and listening and learning and being taught, I have also actually created a differentiation between what I call, this is a theory in development, folks. This is simmering on the burner right now, but I have differentiated between racialized trauma and racialized rupture. So racialized trauma is bodily protective response to structurally oppressive threats or impact. And in other words, a person's body knows how to respond if oppression is coming our way, right? And this is usually the experiences of people that are racially marginalized or oppressed. I differentiate that a little bit from racialized rupture, which is bodily protective response to uphold structural advantage. I see these a little bit differently, that the body for a person with racial advantage or privilege, when they see that their position is about to be threatened, they go, oh, I have to respond a certain way to uphold structural advantage. And sometimes that can actually look really collective and communal. It's not necessarily an individual response. What do we do to band together to uphold structural advantage? Sometimes it's minute, sometimes it's very apparent. So this is a language that I'll be using today when I talk about racialized trauma, right? That is response to threats or impact, or rupture, which is I have to rupture. We'll talk more about why I call that rupture, to uphold structural advantage. My cheeks are warm. Some examples of migrant and racialized traumas, and specifically to Asian communities, which we're focusing on today, but is also applicable to many communities of color. Using RESMA's HIP acronym, which is historical, intergenerational, perpetual, and personal trauma. It helps me to remember all the layers of traumas that take place. So historically, people group may have experienced colonization, imperialism, war, exploitation, such as labor or sexual exploitation, persecution, oppression. And so when a people group experiences this, they're impacted by this, they adapt to survive. And these survival tools are often passed down intergenerationally, right? And intergenerationally, how that might show up is we might be experiencing and also adapting to, responding to displacement, colonial religion, or education. Fear-based parenting could be a form, right? That I'm protective of my children because we have experienced historical trauma. It may look like unprocessed loss. Again, talking is not necessarily the cultural choice for all peoples, right? Poverty is an intergenerational trauma that is passed down historically. Perpetual is a little bit different. Perpetual is the types of trauma that is upheld socially, societally, such as racialized violence, racialized sexual violence, discrimination, othering, exclusion, silencing, erasure. And then this also shows up personally, right? Within oneself, for example, internalized coloniality, racism, white supremacist ideology. As a person that was born in Hong Kong, right, that we were colonized by the British, I internalized all of that. I was anti-Asian, right? I internalized white supremacist ideology. I was taught that white is right, that white is best. And it's I'm continuing to have to heal and confront and dismantle that to this day. Personally, it can show up as a lack of representation of models. So feeling a sense of lostness of how do I develop my identity if I don't have representation around me. It can show up as isolation, lack of belonging, minority stress, which is, I experience this a lot in Texas, which is I walk into a room and I scan, right? Are there any other BIPOC folks in here? Oh, I'm the only one. And then I sit and I look at the door and I wait and hope that another person of color would come in. Has anybody else experienced that? But to live that way perpetually, yes, that's just one form of minority stress. And so when all of these experiences are, traumas are in the body, happening around perpetually, passed down intergenerationally, we also have to look back at what happened historically that got us here. Taking a breath. I'm going to take a moment to just read the chat. Yeah, I'm seeing some resonance. Yeah, so what I'm sharing is stirring up feelings for you. It's okay. We're in this, we really are in this together. Like, we're here together. And I'm not going to leave us here. yes, I'm talking about trauma, but we're also going to talk about what are we going to do about it, right? So if you need to do what you need to do to take care of yourself, but I'm not going to leave us in this place, okay? When turning back to the what happened historically to the Asian experience, and I want to say Asian is a span of a humongous continent, right? That is multicultural, multi-ethnic, multilingual, multi-skin color, hair textures, it's a pluriverse, which is different from a universe, right? A pluriverse of ways of beings, beliefs, languages that can't be summed up in one, but recognizing that, and that's part of the trauma of anti-Asian violence is we are grouped in as one and are being oppressed and targeted as one. So when I say Asian, I'm not being flippant about it. I just want to be concise, all right? So when we're kind of bringing it back to the Asian experience, I want to make some connections about how did we get here? So the connections between colonialism, scapegoating, model minority myth, and sexualized violence, all right? So trigger warning, I'm going to be talking about all of these, and especially trigger warning around sexualized violence. And I am just going to take a moment. So this part, I would say, will take about 10 minutes. And so if you need to step away, I invite you to come back in about 10 minutes time. All right, this is long, because we're talking about history, their story. I try not to say history anymore because it's not history. It's, our story, their story. This is super duper concise, summarized, right? I missed a lot of things, impossible to put everything here, but this is just to give us a timeline. So in the 19th century with European exploitation globally, right? There's the Opium Wars, which impacted my people, colonization, imperialism globally. Then that is when the original yellow peril myth came about, right? This idea that Asians are diseased, dirty, uncivilized, and therefore are suitable for oppression, for suitable to be ruled over. So that is when you hear about yellow peril, that's kind of starting, that's where it originated from. Coming back to Turtle Island, where we are now, 1971 was the Chinese massacre when 19 Chinese people were killed in LA. And the reason is, and it oftentimes is, being scapegoated for taking jobs from, I don't want to say local community, like, because if we're real about it, it's taking jobs from white people. How did the Chinese migrants get here? Many of the Chinese migrants were here as laborers, right? To build the railroads, to mine, a lot of physical labor, and being scapegoated for taking jobs, which is still a scapegoating that we hear for migrant communities, right? Especially Latinx communities. 1975, there's a Page Act that banned Asian women from coming over to Turtle Island on the premise that Asian women were deemed as sex workers. So there's no concept of family, right? That Asians are dehumanized to think, well, they don't need families, but ban the women because they're sex workers and they're going to corrupt this country. 1886, Asians are scapegoated for what they call the Chinese plague, where a mob burned down a dozen Chinatowns in California to the ground. 1882 is the Chinese Exclusion Act, which is the first act that banned an ethnic group of people from migrating to the United States. Here I'm gonna, so in 1893, the US invades Hawaiian monarchy. 1898, US colonized the Philippines. 1900, again, San Francisco Chinatown barbed wire threatened to be burned down, scapegoated again for bubonic plague. 1941, Japanese Americans forced into concentration camps. And so we're seeing just these layers and layers of imperialism, colonization of Asians and Pacific Islanders, but then interwoven with scapegoating, with a lot of hegemony on getting to decide on what terms are Asians allowed to be on this land, which is going to connect later on when we talk about model minority myth. 1950s, US was involved in the Korean War, involved in the Vietnam War. That's way too big for us to cover today, but just wanted to note that. 1966, that is when the model minority myth was coined in the New York Times under this title, Success Story, Japanese 1960s. So this is when I pause, right? I go, all of this happened, and what? Success story? I'm going to delve more into that, but that just, that didn't last very long. This model minority myth didn't last very long. In 1982, Vincent Chin was killed by two white men, again scapegoated for taking jobs. And the judge said about the killers, these aren't the type of men you send to jail. White people aren't the kind of people you send to jail for killing a person of color. Coming into more recent times, more massacres continue to happen. 1989, attack on Cambodian and Vietnamese American school children. 2012, Sikh temple. 2021, Atlanta spots, Korean Asian communities, Korean American communities. 2021, FedEx, Sikh American communities. So anti-Asian violence is not new. And when we look at it from this historical lens, we can see that this was plotted. This is very intentional. This is not an accident, right? And that this is just the perpetuation of colonization, colonialism. So how does that connect with the model minority myth? So the model minority myth is this myth that if Asians work hard enough, then we will be successful. Like the article talking about success of Japanese Americans. And that just makes me pause. I'm like, that's in the 1960s, but just maybe a decade or so earlier, they were in internment camps. They're in concentration camps, right? And so that part, this myth does lend itself to the, what do I call it? Minority stress, right? This expectation that Asians are supposed to perform in a certain way. It erases our identities and, treats us as a monolith. The danger comes when it's about deflecting accountability, right? So the state doesn't have to take accountability for anti-Asian violence, or its colonial efforts overseas. The danger is it erases our story, right? It kind of pastes over this. Okay, but look, if they work hard enough, they can succeed. It's really erasure of our story and disconnects us to our lineage's experiences. This point is really important. It is a white supremacist tactic used to cause divisions between communities of color so that white hegemony can further hoard power. What it aims to do is to say, well, if we uplift one group of color, then that falsely justifies the oppression of other communities of color. So it actually perpetuates anti-Blackness, anti-brownness, anti-indigenousness, and it invisibilizes anti-Asian violence, treats Asians as monoliths to dehumanize and exploit. Oh no, I'm sorry. Ari, can you please help me turn the video back on?
Of course, let me see.
Sorry that happened again.
Don't worry, we have been struggling with tech today. Let me see.
Thanks y'all for your patience. I'm back.
There you go. Okay.
Thank you. So the way that they humanizes and exploits is in continuation of history, right? That the masculine is the worker. They're here to work, to labor, and they're devoid of sexuality. Whereas for the feminine, it's the obedient, the voiceless, but also hypersexual, right? Remember that sex worker, all Asian women are sex worker argument. And this lie can be actually internalized and passed down intergenerationally, meaning parents may teach this to their children, right? That if you work hard enough, then you can uphold the model minority myth, and that will, at least from a survival standpoint, maybe may protect the child from some type of violence or oppression, right? Teaching their children to stay silent even if violence occurs, not to make waves in the face of injustice, perpetuating a gratitude narrative, which I'll explain more. But in this essence, be grateful for what you have. Don't make waves, and that can really be confusing for people of color, for Asians, especially Asian children. That's like, what I'm told I should be does not match up with my reality, but I'm expected to uphold this. And at the same time, the model minority myth is not holding up, because any moment when scapegoating can occur, we see that historically, we see it now. It's only a matter of an instance when the model minority myth then turns back into yellow peril. This is a stock photo that I think illustrates, I laugh because it is so ridiculous, but also it exists. So how does that connect with sexualized violence against Asian femmes and women? So there's a danger of the hypersexualization of Asian femmes and women when it intersects with the model minority myth, right? Asian femmes and women are often seen as hypersexual, but are also compliant and silent. And that's a very dangerous combination. And I'm just showing some ways that sexual fetishization and exploitation is experienced historically, intergenerationally. Some of us may also have experienced this in our lineage, right? For example, sexual assault and murder of Asian femmes and women on or near US military bases. US military bases is a form of colonialism, right? And we see the rates of sexual assault and murder. There is a US military funded sex trade on the basis of so-called rest and recreation. And so, you know, US troops, are basically paid to sexually exploit. I'm just going to sum it up really concisely. I know this is a lot more complex. I don't have the time to go into all of it, which is also why I've listed some articles if you would like to read more about it. So around these US military bases or places that US military has landed upon, then you'll see the construction of red light districts as a response. And red light districts then has led to sex tourism and sex trafficking, where people, Europeans, Americans, actually now go to Asia for the aim of sexual exploitation. It is connected to transnational child sexual abuse, where American people, European people actually target Asian minors and children. Virtually as well. Amerasians is a term for children in Asia that are born from US military parents, namely fathers, US troops that go to Asia, then have children with local women and oftentimes leave children behind, and the children don't have the citizenship rights. There's violence against Asian femmes and women in porn, which is perpetuated into the these falsehoods about us and our humanity. Sexual violence in colonial churches, that's big. We have to do a whole webinar on that, but how the church can, church being used as a tool for colonization, but then also silences people, femmes and women that are being sexually abused. Violence against migrant sex workers. And so when I heard, the morning that I heard the news about the Atlanta spa shootings, I woke up, I looked at my phone, I was in disbelief. And I said, I didn't say, my brain said, my body said, I can't get out of bed. I could not get out of bed. And all I could do was roll over, grab my phone, and text my close friends and go, send love, send care, send prayers. And they didn't even know what was happening, but my body just said, I can't get out of bed. I don't know. I don't know what to do. I don't know what to think. I don't feel. Trauma is in the body. And as you can see, this is not an individualized situation. The trauma that I'm feeling is collective. It's collective, right? And the traumas that we often experience is collective. And that's why if our traumas are collective, so is our healing. And I'm going to move on to that shortly. And coming back to, how we cope then, as immigrants, we often cope with loss and trauma through gratitude narratives. We just say, well, be grateful, right? Be grateful, keep moving, right? I should be grateful to be allowed to live here. I should be grateful for what my ancestors sacrifices. I don't have it as bad as I do. If I stay grateful and work hard, I can overcome oppression. But these gratitude narratives actually doesn't address the underlying pains and the traumas. Gonna try to pause right here. I'm gonna pause right here. And I would like to extend a 5-minute break to us. Do what you need to do to take care of yourselves. And then when we come back, we're gonna talk a little bit more about trauma, and then we're gonna move on to healing. And I'll stay here. You're welcome to chat with me, but we'll come back at 1:05. So take a break, be back at 1:05. Could that be considered toxic positivity? So gratitude narratives demonstrate both resilience and disconnection in order to bear with gratitude in mind. It actually causes one to disconnect from their internal experience. Could it be considered toxic positivity? Gratitude narratives are grounded in oftentimes gratitude to our ancestors. So I would say that's a difference between, for me, gratitude narrative and toxic positivity. That toxic positivity oftentimes is an individualized experience, whereas gratitude narratives is actually often grounded in the practice of gratitude, of ancestral gratitude, which is really sacred to a lot of Asian cultures. So are there similarities? I've only seen toxic positivity used in white spaces, in white contexts. So I'm not quite sure right now of, so I need to think more on that. But thank you for that question. And we're back. Welcome back. I wish I could see y'all. I like seeing faces. Maybe another opportunity, or you can contact me on Instagram. at Melody. Hopefully, love to connect with you. Thank you for the questions. Sometimes I don't have all the answers, but I'll say I'll think about it, and I would love to engage more with you. In the remaining time, this next part, I'm going to breeze by. We talked a lot about trauma. I just wanted to paint a little bit about how trauma shows up in the body and how that's different from racialized rupture. And then after that, I'm going to jump to talking about tending to and collective care. And the reason why I spend time to talk about how trauma shows up is a lot of times racialized trauma and rupture can be misinterpreted, right? It can be misinterpreted as something else. And especially as clinicians or just, you know, beings that care about one another, sometimes when we misinterpret what is trauma and rupture as something different, then that does not enable us to tend to them. And when I talk about racialized trauma and rupture, I talk about it from the perspective of the 4 F responses: flight, fight, flight, freeze, and fawn. And pardon me, I'm going to breeze by this because I'm really excited to get to the what do we do about it part. But when the bodily response is fight, racialized rupture, again, that is the bodily perceived threat, and the perceived threat of some type of dismantling of power or privilege, and one needs to respond to uphold positionality, power, and privilege. So racialized rupture can look like dominating, right? Fight, I'm going to dominate, dehumanize. What that ruptures, entitlement ruptures mutuality. Secondly, it could be defend or double down. It's like, no, I'm not racist, right? I'm going to defend. But what that ruptures is healing capacity. If we can't be truthful, we can't heal. The fight racialized trauma response look different. That's when we're impacted and we go, oh, this is a survival mechanism, right? Racialized trauma response may look like overworking to achieve, right? Model minority myth, if I stuck to that, then maybe I will be safe too. Can look like revenge. I want to take revenge and I want white people to hurt. I'm going to be very mean to white people. It could be resentment, actually being angry at our own people, saying, why aren't my people stronger? Why aren't my people fighting back? Being angry at ourselves. Next one, flight response. Flight. When I think about flight, I think about the gazelle, right? Racialized rupture, it's deny. No. Diminish. No, that's not really happening. Ruptures truth. For example, so-called color blindness, which is an ableist term, okay? Or all lives matter. This is a flight. I don't want to deal with that. I'm out of here, right? Divide or distract. I'm going to divide, distract. The what about is a, but what about this? What about that, right? It's the removal away from. Racialized trauma flight response can mean withdrawal or silence. Like, I'm pulling away. I don't want to talk about this. I'm going to stay quiet. It could be denial. No, I'm good. I'm fine. This doesn't impact me at all. A freeze response. When I think freeze, I think of possum or turtle. Racialized rupture can look like disinterest, right? Ruptures connections. Like, why are we still talking about race? I don't feel anything. And sometimes the body really doesn't, right? Remember, there's a bodily response. This is not a moral or emotional response. It's the body. Goes, why are we talking about this? Or doubt, right? Rupturing reality. Like, for example, well, maybe I can think of some alternate explanation, because that's how conspiracy theories come about. Racialized trauma from the freeze response is helplessness. There's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do. Maybe I'll just focus on my stuff, ignore what's happening. I'll be okay. Disconnecting from community. Or numbness. I feel ambivalent towards my cultural identity. Lastly, fawn. Fawn is the Bambi deer going, if I look cute enough, maybe the hunter will let me go. And so for the racialized ruptures, dissociating from identity, oftentimes through performative allyship or appropriating. Well, it's like, well, maybe if I can appeal to people of color, right? We can easily agree with them without actually committing to inner work. Maybe this is a way I can cope with what's happening. Maybe I'll donate, but not actually have the hard conversations. Racialized trauma for a fawn response can look like appeasing or peacemaking. Betraying fellow Black, Indigenous, and people of color to align with whiteness. You know, it feels safer. Maybe if I align with whiteness, and that would be safer. Or dissociating from identity, wanting to be white. So these are some of the ways that racialized rupture and trauma can show up. And so especially as clinicians, can we notice them when it's happening? And are we able to turn that back to the body? What is happening in the body? And so having these 4 F's is helpful for me, because then I can go, is that fight, flight, freeze, or fawn? Okay, so then I can help reflect that back. And let's talk about where this is coming from. Where did we learn that? Where have we seen that? How has this protected us? What are the consequences? What is the toll? So when we misinterpret sometimes what is racialized trauma and rupture, and we make up all these reasons about it, or we individualize it, oh, that's just anxiety, right? That's just depression. You have nothing to worry about. Let's individualize and deal with the symptoms. We are actually co-opting with this societal individualistic way of looking at trauma, which is asking, what's wrong with you? What's wrong with you? Why is this person acting this way? A trauma-informed therapist would ask, what happened to you? Let me understand, let me hear the story, right? I know there's trauma there. Therapists for liberation might say lots of different things. These are some things that I'm learning to say. Not only what happened to you, but what happened to you and your people, and what is still happening right now. How do we collaborate to seek justice, liberation, and restoration for you and your people? Because if the trauma is collective, the healing has to be collective. How do we connect with your people's ancestral wisdoms and strengths to guide us? That I'm not in a position of an expert to say, I know what's best for you. It's like your people knew how to survive. So what can we learn from them that can guide us? The next slides, I'm going to skip over. This is actually part of the Tending to Racial Trauma training that Sam and I did in the beginning towards the beginning of COVID. Feel free to take a screenshot where I actually dive into the steps of clinically what we can do to collaborate with service users, because I want to move more into the collective space together. So if you're interested in the clinical training, there's a discount for you. All right. And I'll also put the link here. What I want to lead us to is to talk about, from a decolonial framework, how do we rehumanize, reconnect, reclaim, restore, and reimagine? If trauma is held in the body, if ruptures disconnect, we got to bring it back together. We got to bring us back together. To rehumanize is so important, especially for people that have been dehumanized and exploited. We're treated as human resources that are expendable. So to rehumanize is to say we have to just not only restore, but like honor our humanity and honor one another's humanity. Do we remember to eat, drink water, move, rest, laugh, take pleasure, even when times are hard, especially when times are hard? Are we saying, actually, times are hard and this is a time to work harder? That's not humanizing, okay? And so this is an invitation to myself and to y'all, but also in the clinical setting, how do you talk about this, rehumanizing? How do we talk about detangling worth from capitalistic output? There's also power of refusal, right? To resist extraction and exploitation. We may be in workspaces that tries to extract from us. Social media tries to extract from us. We may be in relationships that are exploitive. We have the power to refuse, but that sometimes takes practice. Setting time and energy boundaries, which means saying later or no, I'm human. I'm not a robot. Scheduling wellness and community days. These are ways to return back to our humanity when colonialism has attempted to sever us from our humanity. And this is something we do collectively and we do with one another. There's also connecting with ancestral powers and wisdoms. And a good place to start is to connect with elders in community. We may or may not have elders with us from our immediate lineage, but can we connect with elders and get to know our people's stories of struggles, resilience, and strengths? Not just the trauma and the ruptures, right? But get to know, how did our people survive? What are some things that they held on to that is really sacred and dear? And some of y'all shared that through your food stories, right? Exploring our ancestral foods, rituals, and healing practices that the coloniality of power attempted to say, well, that is so-called uncivilized. That is, what are some things that they say? Oh, superstitious. That is not scientific. That's from a Eurocentric lens, right? But when we get to say, actually, I'm going to lean into, learn about these practices, there is a reclamation and restoration that happens. Reclaiming healing practices, especially the healing practices that have attempted to be erased, stigmatized, or even co-opted, right? Co-opted meaning people in positions of power say, oh, actually, I like what your culture is doing. I'm going to repackage that and sell that back to you. But to reclaim that and say, first, stop. And second, let us embody and learn on our terms. And then very importantly, sharing with future generations. We also have a duty to pass this knowledge on to future generations. A type of resistance is to seek out and share stories, right? To resist erasure. That model minority myth attempts to erase our experiences, but can we together explore our cultures, their stories, especially stories from women, queer, trans, non-binary folks, neurodivergent, disabled people? Like, these are the stories that attempt to be erased. Find out about them, share them, celebrate them, amplify one another's cultural strengths, wisdoms, and practices. For those of you that are interested, I actually have a book list of stories of Asian diaspora. It's a list that talks about like the books that I have read, and then there are books I want to read. And so I'm happy to share that with you if that's something you're interested in. So maybe we can talk about the books that you're reading as well. Yeah. Connecting with all beings. Colonialism ruptures. Says humans are supreme. Land, nature, plants other than humans, right? Animals, they are inferior. That is causing us so much mental, physical, emotional, ecological distress. And we see that in the climate crisis around us. So connecting with all beings is a type of restoration, building reciprocal, restorative relationships with land and all other than humans. If you're in an urban setting, learn to grow food, right? If you're able to be around a body of water, let nature take care of us, be with the elements, whether that your element is air, fire, build a fire, be close to what in a safe way, okay? Safe way. Water, right? It could be land, it could be wood. That's mine, that's my element. I love to be around trees. It's so restorative to me. And for some of you, this might be a new practice, but this can be something to explore, to experiment with, to do in community and see what happens. So as nature takes care of us, we are also responsible to take care of nature because we are nature. Growing native plants, sustainable food, protecting waterways and sources, be with animal relatives, and connecting with more than humans. That is the spiritual, that is the more than humans that we may not physically see, or we may through prayer, singing, stargazing. Can we do that in community, right? To connect back, to reverse the ruptures. Shifting from self-care to community care. This one is big, right? We're in an individualistic mental health field, the mental health industrial complex that sells self-care. Sometimes forms of self-care are co-opted from communities of color. And so we're shifting away from self-care. It's not about the self. The self is, caring for the self is not enough. Is there room for self-care? Of course. I'm sipping my tea But we also have to take care of one another. That's the only way. So finding community, finding people that get you. I know for service users, sometimes isolation can be one of the trauma responses, right? But what does it mean to find community? Can we expand on that? Our pain is interconnected, as is our healing. Community care means sharing stories, sitting around a fire, listening intently, validating. Can mean creating restorative rituals, things that we can do together that is restorative to our souls. Food, my favorite. Hiking. Just went hiking with friends and it was so restorative. I got to be with friends and tree relatives, which is the best. Sing, dance, collaborate and share, right? If we can share what we have, then we own less, we are kinder to the planet, but at the same time, there is a mutuality that happens when we share and we exchange and we give that is very restorative to the soul in an individualistic world. Practicing receiving care while resisting guilt. Guilt says that you got to pull yourself up by the bootstraps. That's, colonial mentality. It's actually, no, I don't. Everybody, I'm responsible for others' well-being, others are responsible for mine. And so practicing receiving care, uplifting, advocating for, and empowering one another. There are also colonial mindsets that shows up in our relationships. So we also have to decolonize and reimagine our relationships. So if our relationships are hierarchical, it could be our work relationship, could be dating relationships, can be parenting relationships, even my relationship with my fur babies. I just called them my fur babies. That's possessive. Self-reflection. But how do we flatten hierarchies? How do we treat each other as sacred? Collaboration over competition. Competition is a type of rupture, right? Not going to talk, too much about it, but how do we create intentionally collaborative spaces that we invest in one another and we also receive? Examine internalized coloniality, embracing diversity in the pluriverse. Eurocentric ideology teaches us there's a universe, there's one way, one ontology, right? One belief, one reality, but we're saying actually there's a gift of the pluriverse, that there are different realities and existences and beliefs, and can we embrace and learn from one another? This one is really important to me, seeking repair when ruptures occur using restorative justice or non-punitive models, that we don't cut people out. We seek repair and hope for accountability. Does accountability always happen? Not always, right? But is there the intent to restore these relationships instead of severing these relationships? Reimagining mental health care for practitioners among us, right? That could mean mutual aid, being and sharing in community, being with nature, movement practices, expressing through music, art, poetry, storytelling, ancestral and spiritual practices, seasonal rituals, food as medicine, reclaiming our healing practices. And lastly, advocacy, activism, and abolition, abolishing all institutions of violence. These are all ways that we can tend to one another's mental health. And these are the things that I hope that you will leave inspired to have more conversations and dialogues about. Bring these into your trainings. Bring these into your process groups. If you're noticing that we're really focusing on the individual well-being, we're talking about individualized techniques, when we're talking about this verbal only type of therapy, can we expand? Can we make room? Can we together, everyone that's here today, bring this into our conversations, that we can shift the field together, that we can decolonize our field together? If you want some resources, please take a screenshot. I'm going to keep moving because I want to save some room for questions. These are some mental health directories and communities that centers on people of color, for folks that want to access therapy funds for Black, Indigenous people of color. Please take a screenshot here. Take a screenshot out if you like some recommendations for QT BIPOC stories. And lastly, stay connected. Inclusive Therapist community. It's free to join for learners. Please join us. We have monthly Decolonizing Mental Health series where we come together, have conversations much like this. If you want to get in touch with me, that is how. That's all I've got to say. Thank you so much for being with us. I want to take a moment to look through the chat and look at the Q&A answers, questions. Ari, do you need anything from me in the meantime?
Oh no, I'm just smiling. Thank you so much for this awesome presentation, Melody. I can share the Q&A for you if that's easier. We have one wonderful comment/question. It says, Melody, I am experiencing you and your presence today in such an abundant way. I appreciate your willingness to offer a theory in development to this community, what it takes to share your ideas in progress, simmering on the burner. Love that. It made me wonder if when you spoke about the model minority myth, if that may be considered a racialized rupture, given how internalizing this falsehood upholds the status quo.
That is juicy. That is juicy. Thank you so much for that question. That gives me something to consider and to actually simmer on and think more about. And so this is a theory in development, and I'm sharing this in community. I don't hoard it, right? What that means is run with it, right? Spend time with it. And if it resonates with you, if you're noticing, making connections, please, I invite you to share with community and talk about it. Can the model minority myth be kind of a form of racialized rupture? I have to sit with that, right? I'm going to say yes and no, because I think the answer is probably somewhere in between. I do see that the model minority myth, can be seen as a way to uphold status quo, to uphold positionality. But at the same time, I think what's important to note is what is the root of it? The root of it is in response to oppression. And I think that's what makes racialized rupture and trauma a little bit different. It is to survive, to avoid being further oppressed, which is different from upholding privilege. However, can that enact harm? Absolutely. People that internalize and have not healed from that racialized trauma of model minority myth can then perpetuate harm and oppression onto others, right? And dehumanize others. And so trauma, it can also be passed down intergenerationally and in community. These are some of my initial thoughts. Not sure if that helped, but love to have more of these conversations. I am seeing the appreciation that each of you are sharing with me. This fuels me to do what I do. Thank you so much for being in community with me. Thank you for the invitation to be here. Please stay in touch. I would love to hear from you, love to hear your ideas, your theories as well in the pluriverse.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much, Melody. I'm gonna